Alright, we're going to talk now about bass-led bands. What are my top 5 bands where the bass player is the band leader, the primary songwriter, or the best musician in the band, or all of the above? This was a topic suggested by a viewer, Eno592002, and I thought it was a great idea, so we're going to go ahead and do it. I'm going to start off with my top 5 bass-led bands, and then you can give me yours down in the comments section. So I'm going to do mine from 5 to 1. We're working up to the number 1. So with number 5, I'm going to pick Typo Negative. And Typo Negative is a heavy goth rock band led by bass player Peter Steele. He was not only an excellent bass player and an innovative bass player who used a lot of different effects and treatments on his bass lines, but he's also the primary songwriter for the band. He was the person who came up with the band's image. He was basically the impetus behind virtually everything they did, although the keyboard player Josh Silver was heavily involved in the production side of things. So when you're listening to Typo Negative, you're basically listening to a Peter Steele project. It's his vision, and I gotta tell you, he's an excellent bass player, he's an excellent vocalist, he's an excellent songwriter, and he was a great concept guy. So I'm going to give Typo Negative my number 5 slot. Coming in at number 4, I'm going to pick the Beach Boys. And some of you might be surprised by this because you think, well, the Beach Boys, did they even really play as a band? Weren't they just sort of singers and a heavy studio treatment on everything they did? Fact of it is that Brian Wilson, who was the genius behind the Beach Boys, was also an excellent bass player, and his bass playing was influential on any number of other important musicians, many of whom were not bass players themselves. And I think he fully deserves this spot because he learned to compose around simple bass lines. So because he came up playing a Chuck Berry inspired simple rock bass, as he grew as a player on both piano and bass, he retained that simplicity. As complicated as his arrangements became, as full-blown as Brian Wilson's genius was, his essence was that at the root of it, there was a simplicity and a melody to everything that he did. And I think if you listen to something like God Only Knows, clear as can be. All right, for the number 3 spot, I'm going to pick The Police. And this is not a surprise to anyone who follows music very closely because Sting has a well-deserved reputation as being an excellent, very tasty and creative bass player, particularly in the early days of the Police. His note choice, his phrasing, his tone, everything about his bass playing was just spellbinding. And on top of that, he was, again, clearly the best musician in the band. He's the songwriter, the lyricist, the visionary, and the frontman, and the vocalist. And he also was more or less the face of the band. So Sting's charisma had a lot to do with the success of the Police, but Sting's bass playing is the driving force of their musical identity. Coming in at number 2, I'm going to pick Rush. And you might have a few people out there who would debate the idea that Geddy Lee is the best musician in Rush, but I think that argument would fold under scrutiny. So without spending too much time on that issue, let's just move on to Geddy's influence in the band. He, again, like Peter Steele, like Brian Wilson, like Sting, he's the primary songwriter in Rush. He is the person who is the driving force behind their musical identity. At the same time, he is an excellent bass player. Geddy Lee typifies musicianship at its highest level, and he never stopped growing as a bass player. As bass-led bands go, it's going to be hard to find one that's better than Rush. Well, there might be just one, and of course that's in my number 1 slot here, and it's the Beatles. Now, a lot of people are going to argue that perhaps John Lennon was a better songwriter or a better singer or a better musician than Paul McCartney. Again, I don't feel that that's the issue. I feel that when you really get down to it, Paul McCartney, particularly in the post-Sgt. Pepper era, where it was his momentum, his vision, his songwriting, and his bass playing that kind of gave that band its throttle. That the Beatles are, in fact, a bass-led band. The bass player in the band is the closest that they have to a single frontman. It's the closest that they have to a driving visionary. It's the closest that they have to a musical master of ceremony, so to speak, or a musical director. So, and there's no arguing with the fact that even if you are not a huge Beatles fan, the Beatles are one of the most influential bands in the history of rock and roll. And one last point I want to make about it in terms of the bass playing part is that Paul McCartney has said many times that one of the primary influences on his bass playing was Brian Wilson. So when he listened to the Beach Boys and he saw what could be done on the bass from this melodic perspective, this compositional perspective, it changed the way he played bass. Now, if you want to hear it for yourself, you can go back and listen to the Beatles from their early recordings all the way through to their later recordings, and you can literally see Paul McCartney's bass playing developing to this much more sophisticated, much more musical context of the Beatles. He might have been the greatest rock bass player in history. So those are my top 5 bass-led bands. I'd love to hear yours, so go ahead and leave a comment in the section below, and remember to like and subscribe. Thanks a lot.